Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're excited to have you. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is The Unexpected Presidents, and it's being presented by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep all of our recordings on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later. Again, we're so excited to have you. We want you to participate as much as possible today. Makes it a lot more fun for us and for you, hopefully. The primary way you can participate today is through our chat box. So if you haven't found that, looks kind of like a little caption bubble. Go ahead and pull that up. You can also be on video if you'd like. Just put a message in the chat and I will work on promoting you once we get started. That said, just be really respectful of our interactive tools. We want to make sure any questions we're asking, any comments we're making are directly related to what our presenters are speaking about today. All right, I just want to thank you one more time. We're excited to have you. This is our website. If you're interested in looking at some of our upcoming programs, which, as I mentioned, are every Tuesday and Thursday all the way through April, you can find those there, and you can also find the links to our recordings of our previous programs if you're interested. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sadie and Sheila, who you came to see.
Thank you, Therese. Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good
Um,
morning. Welcome.
yes, we are so excited to have you here. My name is Sadie Troy. Like Therese said, I work at the Harry Truman Presidential Library. I am in Independence, Missouri right now, so right outside Kansas City. And yes, that Kansas City, in case you've been hearing a lot about it recently.
And I am Sheila Mehta. I work at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library in the center of Austin, Texas, which you're hearing much less about than Kansas City right now. And we are so thrilled to be joining you today. It's funny that Sadie mentions why we're hearing a lot about Kansas City. Maybe our football fans understand why, but maybe our non-football fans might also understand why, because Miss Taylor Swift is getting a lot of news attention. And yes, Sharp, go Chiefs. I think we're biased here, these two presenters of yours, but we have a fun take on looking at our two presidents who have a very interesting relationship today. And we are so excited to present this to you with a unique theme for today. And I'll let Sadie take it over.
Absolutely. So we decided when we were kind of looking, or hold on, I'm gonna get back on here so I can see it. So just so you can, yeah, we've just really introduced ourselves, but we wanted to put a little bit of a modern twist on how we were going to present and talk through the two presidents that we have today, because it actually works out that a lot of their kind of timeline really matches up in the different eras of their life. So we thought, let's put on our own eras tour, right, Sheila, and just really kind of enjoy our time together here with each other. You can see I'm on the left there. I'm a big old history lover. And there's Sheila with her good reputation. So we hope you guys notice some fun little Easter eggs as we go through. But before we start, we asked in the chat, you guys have been sharing where you're calling in from. Keep doing that as we're going, but we also wanted to throw out to you an initial question that we're going to talk a lot about during this session. And so if you guys type in, let us know. I want to hear your input on why are friendships important? Why is it important for people to have friendships? Are friendships just for young people? Is it just for while we're in school and then we grow out of friendships? Type in the chat of what you think, why you think friendships are so important. And hello from Colorado.
Yes.
We are hitting all over.
I know we have a wonderful swath of states. So in the chat, we have folks saying that friendships are important for support, that they help you when you need it. They're saying that friendships are for everyone. They help build up each other. That's that support concept, that they're important because otherwise you can't do things together. Maybe there's even that basic idea of we love having people join us for the fun, right? Um, and Lakewood's coming in saying it's just fun to have friendships, right?
I think that's so important. Yeah. I mean, there
Yeah.
are big important reasons, but sometimes it's as simple as you want to have fun. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
loving that idea of people being there for their support, for building each other up. And that one comment that we had about um, from Lakewood where it said they're for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're for everybody. They're not just for us when we're young. They're for everyone through all spans of time.
You know,
And
we have a comment that just came in that I think it's like they might know where we're coming from in our presentation here because they said that friends are good because they can help with loneliness. And that as adults, we want to see our friends. Someone said my mom is going to QuiltCon in North Carolina because she wants to see her friends. So we'll travel to see our friends when we're older. I think they know what we're talking about today, Sadie.
I
Did
think
we
they do
share
too.
it? Goodness.
Yeah. So, and I think we do too. And I love that it's right for all ages. It's to
Yes.
combat loneliness. Because you've seen our faces, but we really want to introduce you to two gentlemen that we are going to be talking a lot about today. They
And
may
telling you about their friendship.
Yes, and especially their friendship. And they may not have album covers, but these ones look just as good. So this is Harry S. Truman, and he was our 33rd president. And then we're also going to be speaking about
Lyndon Baines Johnson, our 36th president of the United States. And I
and
think these two pictures represent, I think if they had album covers, I think this is kind of what they would probably look like.
absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the tour we're going to be taking you on. And why we wanted to start with that friendship era. And I love that idea about loneliness because both of these individuals held very important jobs in our country in the political sphere, right? So they were very deep into American politics. As you can see, these different roles that they had. And these roles can be tough. They can be challenging. They can ask a lot of us. They can put heavy decisions on people that many people don't understand. They can probably cause some loneliness when you don't have other people to rely on. And so we want to talk through how these two gentlemen, President Truman and President Johnson, really kind of looked at their different eras in life and really came together to help each other push through these big moments and decisions
And dare we say, reach their best friend era.
and reach their best friend era. So we're going to start off on our tour. We're going to start right in our first era, the congressional era of Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson. So I want you guys to take a minute and look at these. Take a minute, and this is you have Harry Truman's congressional era on the left. You have Lyndon Johnson's congressional era on the right. And I want you guys to look at them. What similarities do you see? Right. So we mentioned Harry Truman. He's the 33rd president. Johnson's the 36th. So they have differences, but in their congressional era, are there similarities you're seeing between work that they did? Are there differences you're noticing about their time in Congress? Kind of what's popping out to you?
Lakewood saying that they were both senators. They caught on to that real fast. All right.
Absolutely. So we both have senators.
Mm-hmm.
So
That
those
was
are,
the big one. So we're glad you caught on to that.
yes.
Oh, they were around the same time. They caught that there was Lakewood caught that there's military references in both of their careers.
Yeah. So even though they're not actually serving in the military at this point, but as congressmen, they're both very much thinking about the military and what their role as congressmen may be to support it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Wait,
Lakewood
Lyndon
said they're
Johnson.
They were
Please
both elected multiple times,
we're
right?
going to be talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say Lyndon Johnson did serve during World War II. He actually left his position as congressman and served in the Pacific, then came back and joined Congress again.
I did not know that he actually served.
He did.
Wow.
Based out of Australia. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're
This
noticing
Lady
lots
Bird
of
ran his
similarities.
office. Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah.
Can anyone see any differences? Are there any differences about how they served in Congress? So they both were senators, they both were elected multiple times. A lot of their work involved working for the military.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some things you're noticing that's different, right? They're both kind of serving around the same time.
Ooh, Lakewood pointed out that LBJ served in the House, whereas Truman didn't. Mm-hmm.
Truman
Yeah.
was just in the Senate, that's right.
Yeah. Johnson starts as a congressional aide, then goes into the House and then Senate. So, yeah, he has a slightly different pathway in his career.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't LBJ, oh, we have a good question. Wasn't LBJ the first member of Congress to volunteer for military support? I think in our modern times, yes, I don't know that I could speak for some of our Congress people during the Civil War. I think quite a few of them probably served. So in our modern times, yes, he was one of the first. But I don't want to omit some of the other folks that also served because not in Congress necessarily, but Theodore Roosevelt also left his position in the administration and then served during the Spanish American War. So they
Sheila, we had a difference pop up. So our seventh graders said that they served from different states, which is
good.
totally true. Truman's Missouri, right? Johnson is Texas. But Lakewood popped in a question that I think you can help us answer. And
Yeah.
that says, what exactly is a whip?
What is a whip? That is great. So many of you have heard of like the Speaker of the House, which is the highest ranking official in the House of Representatives. Well, when we go to the Senate, their highest representative for their political party is called a whip. So that's actually the title of the leader of that party. Now, if the party has the majority of senators, they are the majority whip. If they don't have the majority of senators, so our Republicans versus our Democrat, in this case, LBJ was a Democrat. They were the majority of Congress people. He served as their leader, so majority. His counterpart and the Republican Party would then be in the minority, and they would get the title of minority whip. But that actually means the leader of that party for the Senate. And that's a really great question because that's not a phrase that we use all the time, but it's a very important position to know.
And
He was also the youngest majority whip in the history of the Senate at this point.
well, and I love that it's a difference too, because that is such a great leadership position where
Yes.
he's working with political parties on both sides. And it's something Truman doesn't have, right? So
Right.
that's another big difference about their
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
The last before we switch over, because you guys have noticed so many great differences, so many great similarities. And this congressional era for both Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson is really important, right? It's kind of that evolution. It helps them both understand how legislation works because it is our legislative branch. It is Congress that passes our laws, right? Our president signed into law, but our Congress writes those laws and passes them. So that's really a big, important experience that they both had. They're working with multiple political parties while they're in Congress. And I really like that you guys picked up on their armed service experience with Congress because the president ultimately becomes in charge of the military as commander in chief. But so by starting out as congressman, fighting for military rights, or like Truman, he was really investigating how the military was spending money. This really helped them deep dive um, into that function and actually kind of gained both of them a little bit of popularity.
For sure.
Which then pushes them. Oh, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. Please. I was gonna say, like, as Sadie was saying, that they're gonna both be serving on, these military committees and getting this deep dive, both of them are actually serving with very similar ideologies and for the same manner. They're both actually looking at military spending after the end of World War II and after the Korean conflict, and making sure that not only is our military well supported, well staffed, well funded, but also making sure that it's representative of what's needed as well, because the nation is kind of getting back to the post-war realities, and so it's in a bit of change too. So while they're both going to be serving in these capacities, they have different demographics or people that they're serving. One of the things that's going to serve both Harry Truman and LBJ really well is not just holding these important positions, but working, we say, across the aisle or in a bipartisan way. Those are the phrases you might hear today, and working with everybody to make these changes happen. Johnson, because of his career, as you picked up perfectly, he worked in the House, he worked in the Senate, was able to actually know a lot of Congress people just from his experience and work with Republicans and Democrats in a way that was unusual at the time and even today. And that, as Sadie was starting to say, is going to serve them both well in their next era. And that is when both of them find themselves as a vice president of the United States. So Senator Truman and Senator Johnson becomes Vice President Johnson and Vice President Truman. And it's not to, say otherwise. It's kind of a delicate situation, if we will, and that both of them take over and serve for presidents that are very, very popular. And so they're going to come in and when Johnson is the presidential or vice presidential candidate before they're elected, he is running with John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts. And his career in the Senate and the House serve him well. He is from Texas, so he's a Southerner where there's not a lot of Democrats in the South. And so Kennedy really sees the advantage that he has for the Kennedy Johnson administration. And they served together for 3 years, really trying to advance a similar agenda or really get similar laws passed because they're both really, really passionate about it. And it's an interesting time. In fact, you're going to see a lot of similarities between Johnson and Truman when they're vice president. It is after major conflict. The Cold War is beginning or actually well underway for Johnson. Kennedy and Johnson are working towards civil rights, trying to get America to be better in this way. And a really fun aspect that Sadie and I talk about a bit is that President Johnson actually becomes the leader of the United States space program. Vice President Johnson does. And he becomes a big fan of what will become NASA. It's not even NASA yet when he takes over. And so he's going to really work on that. But Truman is a big part of why that space program even exists. So again, we're going to start to see some overlaps in their vice presidential era.
Absolutely. And Harry Truman, so it's kind of the same way how Senator Lyndon Johnson, when he's asked to be vice president under Kennedy, Kennedy is very popular. He's very well known. Truman's that same way. Truman is asked to be vice president under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he was already the sitting president and he was looking for a new vice president. And so he asked Truman. And so Truman is he's known in the Senate and he's known because of that research he did on the military. But he's not really known to the public, especially not as much as FDR is. And so President Roosevelt is very popular. He had been in office for over almost 12 years and was gaining a lot of popularity because he put in ideas about the New Deal to rise the U.S. out of the Great Depression. He was navigating how the U.S. was fighting in World War II. And so Truman is stepping in and really helping him through all this. So he's understanding what it's like to serve during military combats and conflict, right? He's looking at this president who is so beloved and understanding how he's building connections with the American people. The big difference when we look at the vice presidency between Vice President Truman and Vice President Johnson is the length of time. If you notice on this slideshow, Vice President Johnson served as vice president for almost 3 years. Can you find on the slideshow how long Vice President Truman served as vice president under FDR? How long his experience was? Can you find that on the slide? Yeah,
There we
it's
go.
our chat is coming through. It's 82 days. It's
Isn't that
82
wild
days.
to think?
That's crazy. That's less than 3 months. So he had less than 3 months experience figuring out, but this is still a really important time. And it's also a really important position with that both of these individuals served, understanding how to serve under a president and what that requires. And so Sheila and I wanted to put out this to you. Despite having such different term lengths as vice president, both of these individuals knew the power and the importance of the vice presidential role. And so for you guys, what is that role? And why is it important? Why would Vice President Johnson and Vice President Truman be so honored to serve as VP? Why did they find the role of vice president so important?
Lakewood's coming in, repeating something they had said earlier accurately, is to support them. So our vice presidents support our presidents.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. They're their number ones. They're their number one confidant. They're their number one, truly like political supporter. Lakewood's also saying to learn about being the president. Yeah, you know your history. You know, a lot of times vice presidents become presidents. They choose to continue running. We have a question that was in the chat that Sadie, I think you can probably answer well.
Yeah.
Didn't Truman only meet President Roosevelt once as vice president? Did they meet often in those 82 days?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I am so happy to answer it because Truman had a very short time as vice president, right? But it really helped him understand what that role was and how maybe it needs to change in the future. Because that question from Stephen in our chat is totally true. During those 82 days, Truman only had 2 private meetings with President Roosevelt while serving as vice president. While all of those scientists were in the desert working on the Manhattan Project and working on that scientific exploration to see about atomic bombs and weapons. As vice president, Truman had no idea. It wasn't until 12 days after he became president that one of his cabinet members came up to him and said, "Hi, we need to talk. There's something going on that you need to know about." So Truman's learning about this 12 days into his presidency. And we can talk about this later, but it's something Truman does when he's president. Truman is actually the president who kind of redefines the role of the vice presidency as we know it today. When Truman takes over and Vice President Barkley serves with him, Truman brings him to every meeting. Truman keeps him up to date on what's going on because he understands what happens when a president is, like, unfortunately or quickly unable to serve and a vice president has to step in. Truman understood that responsibility. And so he wants to make sure moving forward that all VPs are prepared to take on those burdens and a part of that administration. So thank you so much for putting that in the chat.
Yeah. We also have an interesting question. Are vice presidents and presidents always good friends? And the answer is no, not always. When the United States first created the Constitution, vice presidents were elected separately from presidents, so they could even be of 2 different political parties. And then they would have to find a way to work together, and they realized that's actually not very efficient. And so they created a constitutional amendment and they said, nope, you have to run on a ticket. That's the phrase we use. So that's why President Kennedy selected, Senator Johnson to be his running mate. And if Kennedy is elected, that means Johnson becomes vice president. So you're electing both of them. And with FDR's running for his fourth term, he selects Senator Truman to be his running mate on the ticket. And so you'll see more political alignment, but it doesn't actually mean that they were friends. Kennedy and Johnson didn't know each other all that well. They end up becoming pretty close. They do have similar thoughts and ideas for the nation. And obviously, Truman and FDR didn't get a lot of time to really become friends. But yeah, it all sorts of things. Sometimes they are really good friends and they choose to run together because, like our friends, sometimes we're better together. And sometimes they choose someone that will help them to balance out where people like them, where their ideas are, where their strengths and weaknesses lie. So it's more strategic who their vice presidential candidate might be. That's a wonderful question that you ask. So the answer is sometimes.
And Sheila, I think it's something we're actually going to circle back to because
We
I
are.
love this idea that you are thinking about friendships because this is something we're going to go to.
Yep.
Because, right, these roles can be so challenging. They can be isolating. You want a friend there who you can bounce ideas off of, who you can trust their advice. And sometimes as president, that's your vice president. But we're going to see in a little bit, sometimes as president, maybe that's someone else who may have held that same role or who has been working with you. So I love this idea that friends are there to give that advice and support, and where we can possibly look for that.
And we have a really good question about who becomes vice president once a vice president becomes president. Early in American history, the answer was the Senate elects them. Today, it is actually more of an appointment by the new president that Congress confirms. So we're seeing our separation of powers and checks and balances come into play in this case. So typically, the president will nominate and Congress will approve. And today. Mm-hmm. It goes outside of our presidential line of succession just a little bit because it's not a succession up in that traditional way once the president or the vice president becomes president. Great question. We have really government-minded participants.
Literally just thinking like these questions coming through are so great and we're able to talk about so many things.
Outstanding. They're outstanding.
So I've switched our screen and you can see that we are true. We just talked about their vice presidential era. And now as we're on our eras tour, we're hitting a new one, kind of, right? So Truman, Vice President Truman and Vice President Johnson both assume the role as a US president, but in a way that's different from many other presidents within our history of America. So Vice President Truman and Vice President Johnson aren't elected from vice president to president. They actually take over because both President Roosevelt and President Kennedy pass away or die during office. So Truman and Johnson are kind of thrust into this new era of their life, this new role that they weren't even really kind of ready for. And we talked about President Roosevelt was popular. He had been president for 12 years. President Kennedy, he was our youngest president. He was making all these advances, as Sheila talks about, in the space race and within civil rights. And so these are extremely well-known presidents. So as you think about Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson coming up into this new office, what challenges do you think they may have faced immediately moving from vice president to president, right? What challenges might they have faced that other presidents who were elected may not have? What do you think it was like for them to step in a role of people who were so popular? Mm-hmm. What kind of
they're ready to go. They're ready. So Lakewood is saying that they have to catch up on everything suddenly. And we also have that not everyone knew who they were that much. They picked up on something that you were saying earlier, Sadie. There's also the backlash from people who might not know them or like them very well. I think they know a little bit of the story of President Johnson. And then they have to win over people and get their support. We have some brilliant participants today.
so brilliant. These are
Yeah.
absolutely right. President Truman, President Johnson, they have to take over quickly. They have to figure out what's going on, right? The country just lost a leader, so they're kind of grieving, and now they have to figure out how are they going to take over, what's happening. Are they going to be as popular? They have to learn. I just saw in our chat all the responsibilities the president had, right? Because the vice president doesn't always have to do as much
Oh
as the
no.
president. Their roles
Yeah.
are different. Um, Sheila, what were other ones that we were kind of thinking about? Um,
One of the ones, some of what we were thinking about is honestly stepping into these big shoes, right? That they both had these very well loved, well supported, not everyone, but well supported, well loved figures that they now have to kind of live in the shadow. And the nation's sad. They have to take over in a time of great tragedy and rise to the occasion. Lakewood brings up that people doesn't don't really like change, and they definitely don't like change when they're, and when it's tragic, like the deaths of our presidents, which is not common in US history, is to have this happen. We also were talking, like a lot of our friends are saying, is they have to take over and make the presidency their own, but still honor the presidents that they served, because they did like them, they did support them, they were running together. And so it's both being continuing that legacy, but also shaping it to their own, because they are unique people. And we're going to see that with some of the changes that they make policy wise, updating, FDR's and Kennedy's policy, but also expanding it to make them their own. That's where we were headed in this era, because the presidential era is where we start to see a lot of changes for these two individuals in making the executive office, their own after this great tragedy of beloved leaders.
exactly. It's hard, right? It's hard to put your own spin. You want to honor the person before you, but you want people to know that you can do the job and you have ideas too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm noticing that we are talking a lot about Truman and Johnson separate, right?
Right.
So we were talking, like, we've had them side by side and we're kind of comparing and contrasting their time in Congress, their time as vice presidents, their time as presidents. So as we kind of think about them in separate ways, are any of you picking up on anything that you can see that might make President Truman and President Johnson, that might bring them close together, that might kind of lead to a friendship? Or have you been seeing things that might kind of show that maybe they're not gonna work together very well, or maybe they might stay a little separate, or enemy frenemy type of things? But
Maybe there's some bad blood.
oh, that was a good one.
Thanks.
But yeah, what have you been seeing? Because we've been talking about them separately. Like, are you noticing anything that may show that
Mm.
they might come together, work, help each other, develop a friendship, or maybe their differences are too much?
The brilliance is continuing in the chat, Sadie.
Love
We have
it.
three responses, and they might as well just hop on and present. They're saying that the bond, so Lakewood saying that they could have a bond about having to take over suddenly, so that shared experience, that they're both thrust into these roles. They have similar backgrounds. Look at them picking up on that. We didn't think they would get that so fast. That they had similar experiences all the way around. Um, Sharp Homeschool's making silly comments like, that's why we can't have nice things
I
sometimes.
think that's a Taylor Swift's.
Oh, I know,
Part
that's
of
why I was like,
that.
we're being silly, but I love it because it's something we have to keep in mind, is how these transitions work. But you're picking up on it beautifully and wonderfully about the realities of what could make them friends. But I'm not seeing anything that would make them enemies or frenemies. Is there nothing we can think of? It's possible. They were
It
from
must
the
not,
political
right?
party. Yeah.
They were from the same party. They both experienced a lot of change and growth within
Oh,
their
yeah, they
political.
both supported civil rights. We have some Truman and LBJ scholars here.
They do.
They
So
do.
yeah, I mean, maybe all things are pushing to a new era, and that would be the best friend era. And I think you guys are you hit on so many of the great things that
Perfect.
really do bring them together in this time frame.
Right. Yeah, and so what we're seeing in this best friend era, and it's exactly what you had said, due to honestly this really tragic situation, they both are thrust into these new roles in a very similar situation. They have similar backgrounds as congressmen, which will help them very, very well. But they transition from vice president to president in a traumatic situation. They have to rise to the occasion to console the nation, to keep it moving forward. And so they overcome this tragedy. There's also very few living presidents at this time. When Truman takes over, there's a few. When Johnson takes over, there's just a few. So there's very few that know what the job is like. And that means, think about when you said friends are the people that support you. Now think about it from the role that if there's a job where someone can support you, who's done that job? Unfortunately for Truman and Johnson, very, very few people have. What, like three for each of them? And we'll talk about that in a second. They, with similar backgrounds as Lakewood talked about, they're both Southern Democrats, which gives them an advantage, but also a disadvantage in some parts of the United States. And it's also, they're sharing a very similar time frame, even though they're about, um, you know, 15, 20 years apart. They're actually still in a very chaotic world and international scene. The United States is trying to play this role of an international peacekeeper, but also make sure that that the American people are doing well, because it is a time of transition. So you were thinking about this so brilliantly, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about these challenges that these soon-to-be best friends, not to ruin it, right? I think we can go ahead and say it with this adorable picture that they
I think
pointed
so.
out.
And what I
Yeah.
love is you guys is that everyone at home and in school, they can't see the chat, but multiple people are commenting about this picture and just how endearing and adorable it is, and how
Yeah.
it brings them together. And I think that I just love that I mean, so many of the same ideas are flowing between everyone throughout this.
Yes. Yeah, you're picking up on it. Lakewood wants to be their best friends too. So do we, Lakewood. So do we.
Right. So that's so cute. But this just kind of explains in a little more detail what those connections were, right? And so how the challenges that they were both facing, especially Truman having gone through it before, this best friend era really does happen during Johnson's presidency.
Right.
So Truman is actually retired. He's living back in Missouri, here in Independence, like I am. And for all sense and purpose, he could have just retired and kind of just stayed at home, read his books, wrote his letters, enjoyed time with his wife Bess and their daughter Margaret and his 4 grandchildren, and really kind of taken that, retirement life, to the top.
Mhm.
But he really does stay very active in politics and understands that the challenges that Johnson is facing are very personal to him because they are ones that he went through. And he knew he would have liked the support that was given. So he wanted to be that support because look at what they went through. Truman, we talked about during the beginning of his presidency, he comes in during World War II, right? So it's his task on how do we finish out World War II? How do we bring our soldiers home? How does this conflict end? That's a war that people really know about Harry Truman, but also during his presidency is the Korean conflict and the Korean War. And it was actually his decision on whether or not to send troops when North Korea, a communist country, invades South Korea, a democratic country. And Johnson has that same trouble, right? He has a military conflict under his presidency, and that's the Vietnam War. And Truman understands that when we talk about the president as commander in chief, they're not just signing off on the military and saying, do what you do. They're worried about soldiers' lives. They are involved in the strategic planning of the campaigns. They are in charge of gathering public support for both the individual soldiers and the military overall itself. They are in charge of funding and budget and keeping people abreast on how they're developing weapons and what's going on. So the idea of being a commander in chief is a very detailed job that takes a lot of emotional and physical responsibilities. And so Truman understand that, and that's one connection they had as president.
Right. And we talked a bit about both of them being the leaders of the Democratic Party. They're both Southern Democrats and legislators. And y'all have picked up on that. So I actually want to go to the chat. And Stephen asked, and I think a good question that we can talk about this with, but also a little bit more into this best friend era. And they asked, wasn't their relationship more father-son than best friend? Age-wise, the answer would be yes. However, it was a little bit more mentorship that becomes friendship, truly. And what ends up happening is the very first night, right after President John or Vice President Johnson takes the oath of office, he's still in Dallas dealing with the tragedy. He makes several phone calls to try to make sure that he is ready to move forward. And two of those phone calls are to former President Eisenhower and former President Truman. And while he will consult both of them, a good chunk, if not the entirety of his presidency. Former President Hoover is still around, but he's very ill at this time. So there's not a lot of communication there. But he will actually end up leaning on former President Truman much more because, as you picked up on those very similar shared experiences that Eisenhower did not have to go through. And so what ends up happening is Truman becomes this mentor to him, but very quickly they realize how much they enjoy one another. And it does become a friendship. In fact, in 1964, when President Johnson gets elected to his own term, we have this adorable phone call, and it is really adorable, where President Johnson calls Truman and says, well, inauguration's coming up. Do you want to grab some friends and come stay at the Blair House, the official guest house of the president? And he said, well, you just grab your friends and you come on over. We'll have it waiting for you, which is kind of like an equivalent of a presidential sleepover, which is kind of funny to think about. But he's like, well, you're welcome and we want you there. And come on over, let's join us. And we have phone calls where he's telling Truman, like, I'm going to come out and visit you. I haven't seen you in a while, would like to talk. And so while it makes sense that it might be a father-son, I think the respect that was there and honestly, how much they grew to love each other, it really was a best friend relationship. And the role that their wives played is Miss Bess and Miss Ladybird actually they were quite keen on one another and became really great friends. So it really was this best friend couple group, if you will. And that served Johnson very, very well. He knew he could go to Truman for the honest truth. He respected his opinion on, the movement of the Democratic Party, legislation, conflict, a lot. We're going to talk about how similar their wants for the nation are in just a second and what they were both trying to do. And it's shockingly similar. And that's one of the reasons they could rely on each other. So it might seem like father-son, but it really is a little bit more of a best friend era. That's a great question to ask.
Well, and Sheila, I love, and I know we're going to touch on that in the next slide, but I love that what you just pointed out, when we talk about their friendships, they have these extremely similar shared experiences, rising through Congress to VP to taking over president suddenly, right? They understand the roles of commander in chief during conflict. Right. They understand that when you're the party leader, what responsibility that means, whether you are getting yourself elected, but getting governors and congressmen and state congressmen elected. Right. And then when you're passing legislation, because that last one with the legislation filters into not only are they bonding over their shared experience, but their beliefs, right? They have very similar political beliefs or ideas for how they think the American people should be supported.
Right.
And that's one thing that I'm glad we're about to touch on, because that's one of the real things that solidifies their best friend era, right?
Right.
It's their experiences, it's what they've done, but it's also kind of who they are and their beliefs at their core.
Right. And also really good for that is, keeping in mind the situation, the circumstance in which both of these leaders served as president. Harry Truman didn't have a Democratic majority in Congress. President Johnson did. And so they had different fights, they had different successes, but they had, as we're about to get into, they had very similar wants for the nation. They just had different Congresses to work with. But remember, both of them were legislators, so they know how to work their best within those circumstances. Let me take this one. I'll
Yeah,
talk about it because
well,
I love
I
talking
was
about the
listening, like,
legislation.
you're doing so good. Like, keep going. This sounds great.
Look at my supportive friend Sadie, right? So yeah, another photograph that we love. You like the other one where they were walking together. We call this the sunglass picture. We love this picture because I think they just look so happy and cool, like friends hanging out, right? Just two former president friends like we do on the weekends.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah, it's
really
like presidents. They're just like us.
they're just like us, right? The big smiles. Yeah, Lakewood,
Yeah.
right? They're having a grand time. This is actually when President Johnson is out visiting Truman at in Independence, actually. And so you can see here on the slide how their ideas and their wants for the nation were similar. You can see they both wanted Medicare. They wanted to make sure that the American people were able to have health care, to be healthy, to maintain a healthy nation. They were both fighting for equality. They were both actually something a lot of people don't know. They were both fighting for housing rights because there was a lot of issues with people being able to have secure housing in the United States. And they were both fighting for education to improve. The difference, as I said before, was how much Johnson was able to accomplish that Truman wasn't, but Truman laid the foundation for Johnson to be successful. And with Medicare, Truman tried to get this passed, but Congress fought him on it. And by time Johnson got into office, he was able to get more support in that, 10, 15 years to pass the Medicare law. And honestly, to honor President Truman's hard work in getting that done, he goes and signs the Medicare law into effect at the Truman Library. And he says, you're the one that started this fight to get healthcare to the American people. We're going back to your place and we want you to sign it. Or I want to sign it with you. And so Truman and Miss Bess were standing right next to him as he signed this law. And he was really giving credit where credit was due. They're both going to work to advance civil rights. If you don't know, one of the biggest things that happens and the biggest step towards equality is President Truman desegregates the military and does what he can in that government sphere when states were really fighting equality and civil rights. President Johnson is able to use that momentum to make poll taxes illegal and then to sign into law the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. Again, because President Truman made those early steps in his area of control. They're both going to pass housing laws to make housing more accessible. American lives are going to change drastically because of this. It's not something we think about a lot, but it really is so impactful on the way that Americans live. And as we are in this educational environment together, one of the biggest things is that President Truman says, we need to be focusing on education more. Nobody is talking about this enough, and we need to do better for the children of America because they are our future. And he sets out this new agenda, and I guess at this point, he's Congressman, Senator Johnson, agrees with it so immensely that he starts passing laws when he gets into office to make this vision that they both share a reality. He passes over 60 pieces of legislation just on education. And the first we really hear about looking at an improved situation for education comes from President Truman in 1949. So let's talk about best friends, right?
So
Look at that.
yeah. I mean, I think, for all that we talked about them being separate, it really just collide so deeply and wonderful in this time. And it's about their shared experience, it's about their shared beliefs, but then it's about what they did together, right?
Right.
Like it's about those actions. And I know we've been talking about best friend era with Truman and with Johnson, but this is just one example. And so looking at all we talked about, like, what conclusions are you coming to? Have you had any good takeaways of, like, we talked about why people have, like, why it's important to have friendships. Um, can you build on that? Like, did you see any of those reasons um, through this, through Truman, through President Truman and President Johnson with their relationship? Did they connect with why you think it's important to have friends?
Look at Lakewood's response, Sadie.
Oh, I love
Isn't that a
that.
brilliant response? Let's share it out.
Lakewood,
I'll let you share it
yeah.
out.
Well, I was gonna say Lakewood just said they can help you be better people or leaders. And I love that.
All the snaps.
Oh,
Brilliant. Yeah. We want our friends to lift us up, right? We like our friends because they're kind and they're sweet and they support us. They make us better just by being around them. They help one another. Here we have another one. They're good friends because they help one another. And then if you're in a position of leadership, a good friendship will help you to be a better leader too.
I mean, I love that. And I'm gonna it's we
Brilliant.
kind of have it here in the last question, but I'm gonna capitalize on what Lakewood said. How did what we just learn about Truman and Johnson and what they worked towards with each other, how can we turn that in our own lives, right? We're not all the president of the United States and we're not all in Congress signing laws, but how can we use their example in our own lives about being better friends? How do we turn this from looking at the presidency and best friends in Congress and politics to look at how we become better friends today in our lives?
While they're thinking and writing, I can say that, Sadie is 3 states away from me and she's one of my work besties, even though she's 3 states away and I don't get to see her every day. And one of the things that when we work on projects like this one that is in front of us, as well as projects that aren't in front of students, I think Sadie brings out the best in me. I think we challenge each other's ideas in wonderfully supportive ways to make them better and bigger and grander. And so I can say, for my work bestie, how she makes me better and how I can support her and she supports me.
Well, and I really appreciate that. And I'm like, while they're typing in, and we've had some good responses, I want to build on that too, because Sheila and I, um, she she takes random thoughts that are up here. And when I'm like, okay, this is my idea, and I think what I'm thinking about, and she's like, I got it. And then she can verbalize it in a way where I'm like, that's the smartest thing I've ever heard, right? She can take, like, we can push what we're each thinking to a new level, to take it someplace. But she can really, when I start talking in circles, when I don't know if I'm making sense, Sheila can just perfectly summarize it and share it in a way that others will understand. And so that really makes it easier for me to talk with people and to share my ideas in ways that they can understand, which is great. Lakewood, I was going to pop in, shared that they learned,
Yeah.
we can share ideas and thoughts with our friends and we can build on what they're good at.
Beautiful. We have some really great supportive thinking. One, we have some very government minded friends joining us today because they are on fire this whole
Yeah.
time. And I can tell they also have really sweet hearts as well, right? So we've had a couple questions too, that is, and I know not everyone can see this, but is President Johnson and Truman still alive? Both of them have passed away. They would be extremely old at this point. So neither of them are still with us. And there was one question: didn't LBJ attend Truman's funeral just before his own death? Yes, he did. They President Johnson or Lyndon Johnson didn't live nearly as long as Harry Truman did, and they actually passed away pretty close to one another, sadly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Harry Truman passed away in 1972, which may sound like a long time ago, but imagine Harry Truman was born in 1884.
Which is
Is
why
that
he would
right?
not be alive today.
Which is why he would not, um, born in the 1880s. So, yes, he passed away, but he lived into his 80s. And his wife actually lived 10 years longer. So, um, those Trumans, they had long, very fulfilled lives. Yes, Truman. I always like to see when we think about history, Truman lived to see a lot of things. Sheila mentioned that President Johnson fought in World War II. Harry Truman fought in World War One.
Right.
Harry Truman, being born in the 1880s, think about what people are driving. Think about how they're going from place to place in the 1880s. And then think about Truman lived long enough to see a man land on the moon, right? That
How
space
cool is that?
race that President or that Johnson and Kennedy were pushing actually was fulfilled with the US landing on the moon. And Truman lived long enough to see it. So think about going from the 1880s to seeing somebody walk on the moon. It is quite a lifespan.
Mm. He's seen a lot. All right, in the last few minutes that we have together, you've been wonderful in the chat asking questions. We're trying to address them as we go. But a last little Taylor Swift reference for you guys, if you can pick up our Easter eggs there. If you have any questions, we would love to answer those for you. No, Lakewood, this is not real. They're looking at historic photos, and we were being silly and put Taylor Swift covers. Taylor Swift was not born when this picture was taken.
It was not, but I think she would very much appreciate our Eras tour that
I
we
think
took
so.
you on, right? I think she would very much appreciate the eras that President Truman and President Johnson went through, all to culminate with their best friends. What is that?
Mhm.
This is that what we do?
Yep.
That's what we do. That's it.
Wonderful. All right, if you have questions, let's throw those in the chat in our last little bit. I know some folks are needing to head out soon. We want to respect our time and our learning or our break. Sometimes our brains need a little bit of their. Oh, great question. Is that Hubert Humphrey behind LBJ? You know your vice presidents. That is Hubert Humphrey, his vice president to President Johnson. And that's just the top of his head and his ear right there for you. Yeah. Nice
That's so
catch.
wonderful. Stephen, that picture was taken at the Truman Library. So they are actually in the building that I work at. And I had no idea who that was. So I'm glad Sheila answered that
Yeah.
question because you have an eagle eye and I appreciate that.
Lakewood has a really cute friendship question. Were their children friends? We talked about the two of them and then their wives. Their children were not really friends. There was a big age difference between them. When President Johnson was in office, his daughters were young 20s. And so they were really quite young. And President Truman's children were grown adults at that time. So there's really just for an age difference and a generation difference. They were not friends, but they did know one another and they did see each other quite often when the Trumans came up to DC, and then when the family had the opportunity, more than just Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, to go out to Independence. So they
Well,
did see each
and
other every now and again.
one interesting thing I'll throw out is some people might not know this, but there is a society of presidential descendants
Yes.
that Truman's daughter has passed away, but he still has his grandchildren are still living, and so I'm sure some of Johnson's grandchildren are actually members of that society, and every couple years they meet in a different city around the country. So there is actually a society of presidential descendants that still kind of brings the families together to talk about their family members and the experiences they had with those individuals.
Yeah, and Lucy and Linda Johnson, President Johnson's daughters, are still around, and they are part of that group.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you,
I think they have
Therese. We
yearly
can pass
meetings.
it to you because I know we're hitting right at that time.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I just want to say thank you for everyone who attended. You guys were great participants, great questions. I
Stellar.
really appreciate you coming. And um, thank you to our presenters. This was incredible. This was so fun and so interesting. We really appreciate your time and all the creative effort you put into this presentation today.
Well, thank you for letting us be a part of it. We love participating in presidential primary sources every year.
Every year. We were excited to do this. We look forward to seeing you
Awesome.
throughout this season and next season. So hopefully we'll be
Yes.
seeing you all again.